On November 19th, 1884, with the noon temperature holding at 21 degrees and a north wind moving steady near 30 miles an hour, Cole Ramsey stood on a wind-scoured rise in western Nebraska and drove the first survey stake into 8 acres of rocky ground that no rancher had wanted at any price. 40 miles east lay the nearest rail siding, a thin lifeline of timber platform, telegraph key, and freight ledgers that could vanish behind one hard storm. 40 miles west opened only grass, shallow draws, and winter distances that had buried stronger men than Cole. Endurance itself held 287 souls, 1 church, 1 general store, 2 blacksmith hearths, and a wagon economy so fragile that a blocked road could empty kitchens within a fortnight. Yet that afternoon, as dust and old snow traced low circles around his boots, Cole marked angles and distances with a calm precision that made the rise look less like abandoned land and more like the beginning of a design. He was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders from rail years and narrow through the waist from widowhood, with hands that had set spikes, turned transit screws, and buried one wife in ground too hard for honest grieving. He spoke little in public, not from timidity, but from habit, learned where wind stole half a sentence, and men had to choose their words as carefully as their rations. In endurance, where loud certainty passed for leadership, silence was mistaken for deficiency. The wealthy merchant Gideon Pike, whose store windows displayed imported china, canned peaches, and bright cloth every Saturday, called Cole a relic of poorer days and told customers that prosperity had made old caution unnecessary. Others echoed him with frontier ease. By Christmas week, boys on the street had begun calling Cole the ditch surveyor whenever he passed with line chain and notebook, and their fathers did not correct them. Cole did not answer insults. He carried, instead, a doctrine assembled from labor, loss, and inheritance. His father, Elias Ramsey, had been a track engineer who spent 12 winters among Finnish crews, laying and maintaining northern lines, where drifts rose higher than locomotive boilers and a misplaced culvert could kill a camp. The older Ramsey had taught his son that winter was not weather but logistics, not a season but arithmetic, heat retained versus heat lost, grain stored versus mouths fed, distance to shelter versus wind speed across open cuts. When Cole was 17, father and son had crossed a line section at dawn after a 3-day blow and found 2 section hands dead within 60 yards of a warm bunkhouse. Men who had turned one time too many in white air and walked in circles until strength failed. The older Ramsey had made no sermon of it. He had only said, as he measured drift depth against the ties, that pride was a poor coat. Elias Ramsey died in 1878 when a brake chain snapped during a descent south of Cheyenne and a loaded maintenance car jackknifed at a curve. The injury did not kill him quickly. Fever and lung congestion did. For 9 days, he dictated practical notes from his bed in a boarding room, insisting that Cole write every figure in the same ledger, fuel quantities for sub-zero nights, wall thicknesses for reduced heat loss, safe spacing for storm guide ropes, and the proper shaping of a chimney throat to preserve draw under crosswind pressure. He died before first snow that year, and the ledger passed to Cole with no ceremony except use. Cole married at 31, and for 9 years he and Margaret Ramsey kept a modest claim near a branch road north of Endurance, selling survey work, odd carpentry, and draft mapping to settlers too poor for formal contracts. Margaret kept accounts in clean columns and could stretch 1 sack of flour farther than any cook in the county. In the spring of 1883, she took ill after a late thaw brought bad water through a shallow well line. Fever carried her in 6 days. Cole buried her under cottonwoods by the creek and sold the claim before autumn, because every doorway and kettle in that house measured absence too exactly. By the second week of November 1884, he had moved to Endurance with a pension from railroad years, One mule, one bay gelding still young enough for hard country, and the ledger his father had left him. He rented a narrow room behind the blacksmith for $2 per month and spent evenings at a table near the stove drawing plans no one had requested. His figures did not describe a house in town. They described a post on high ground, partly below grade and heavily banked, with storage to outlast road failure, a chimney tall enough to throw a signal above drift haze, and a layout that allowed travelers to approach by fixed lines when road and horizon disappeared together. He chose land that looked worthless because it had the one virtue that mattered in storm country: exposure visible for miles. He paid $24 cash for the 8-acre parcel, then another $6 for legal filing and county stamps. Teamsters laughed when they heard the purchase amount and asked why a widower would pay money for rock and win. Gideon Pike answered for him from the porch of his store, one polished boot heel resting on a flour barrel. He was a large, well-fed man of 48, with trimmed beard, heavy wool coats from St. Louis wholesalers, and gold watch chain bright against his vest, a figure who wore comfort like authority and had begun to believe they were the same thing. "The ditch surveyor has bought himself a graveyard without corpses," he said, loud enough for the hitch rail and wagon queue. "Give him one winter and he will crawl back to town for sensible work." Cole purchased no cattle. He purchased materials. In December 1884, he bought 2 used picks for $1.40, a broad spade for 75 cents, and a hand auger for 90 cents. In January, he contracted a quarry crew near Granite Bluff for rough limestone at 85 cents per hundredweight, delivery extra when roads held. He ordered quicklime in 30-pound sacks, paying 14 cents per pound in spring rates before demand could rise, and he arranged for salvage timbers from a dismantled freight shed, each beam measured and marked to fit a roof structure set partly into earth. His pension should have gone to visible prosperity in endurance custom, livestock, parlor furniture, perhaps shareholding in Pike's winter stock. He spent it underground. When frost left the top layer in March 1885, Cole set baseline stakes with a surveyor's chain and transit, then marked a rectangle 28 feet by 16 for the main post house chamber, oriented long side east to west to reduce direct wind pressure on the door face. He dug 7 feet down to hardpan in step cuts so the walls could seat without slough, removed spoil by mule cart, and banked reusable sod in separate mounds for later wall covering. The entry corridor ran 6 feet, angled 20 degrees off prevailing northwesterlies with room for a second interior door to form an airlock. He drafted bunk tiers along the south wall, initially 16 sleeping places each 24 inches wide, with storage niches cut between support posts. At the rear, he planned a pantry pit lined with stone and vented by narrow flue, designed to hold root vegetables, oats, beans, and salt pork below freezing threshold but above spoilage damp. In August 1885, the Platte Supply Road took a flash flood that tore out 2 timber bridges and stranded freight for 6 weeks. Coal allotments came late. Lamp oil doubled from 22 cents to 45 cents per gallon in town trade. Nails grew scarce. At the church steps the following Sunday, Cole petitioned for communal grain reserves and a sheltered relay post on the rise. Gideon Pike dismissed him in front of ranchers, teamsters, and farm families, declaring that endurance needed ambition, not Ramsey's folly, and that fear was bad for commerce. Laughter followed, then nods, then the practical silence by which communities decide to do nothing. Cole returned to the rise and watched for signs older than any store ledger. Beaver on Cotton Run lifted dam repairs 2 handspans higher than the previous autumn mark. Geese passed south in disciplined strings before first hard frost. Barometer swings came abrupt and deep, the same pressure behavior he had seen before early lockups on rail cuts farther north. Within 3 days, he sold his silver watch in town for $12 and applied every cent to iron hardware and additional lime. By the first week of September, he had laid the chimney footing, a square base 6 feet by 6, sunk 30 inches, reinforced with stone keyed crosswise to resist heave. He raised the stack in courses, keeping the inner flue smooth and narrow, then widening to a double throat draw designed to hold pull under variable wind. At 32 feet above grade, the top would clear low drift haze and carry smoke like a marker over open country. Travelers who never saw endurance would still see that signal. That was the point. Children still called him the ditch surveyor from passing wagons. Men still shook their heads at the labor of one widower with mule, line, and ledger. Cole set each stone true, struck each mortar joint tight at 1 part, quicklime to 3 parts clean sand, and measured his wall thickness again before dusk. He worked as if the future had already sent word and was waiting only for completion. By dusk, the mortar in the upper courses had begun to skin over in the dry wind, and Cole climbed down from the scaffold plank with lime dust on his sleeves and measured the day's rise against a chalk line he had cut at dawn. 9 inches. Not enough for pride, enough for schedule. He walked the perimeter once more, tapped 3 stones that sounded hollow, and reset them in fresh mix before dark, because a weakness hidden in September would become a death sentence in January. The bay gelding cropped sparse grass beyond the spoil mound, ears turning at each strike of trowel against stone. Cole called him Slate then, not for color but for steadiness, and the horse lifted his head as if acknowledging an old duty being named aloud. The following week, with morning temperatures falling to 34 degrees and frost holding in shadowed cuts until near noon, Cole began roofing the buried chamber. He laid salvaged beams on 16-inch centers, seated them in stone pockets, and pinned each with hand-forged spikes bought dear from the blacksmith at 7 cents apiece. Across the beams he set rough planks, then a layer of tarred canvas, then 6 inches of packed clay. Then sod returned root side up so late, autumn growth would knit the cap against wind scour. The structure did not look like prosperity from the road. It looked like a low wound in the hill with a chimney rising from it. Gideon Pike stood at his store porch and called out, for all the wagon queue to hear, that the ditch surveyor had gone underground to hide from his own predictions. The name, the Grave Pipe, took hold that month and moved through endurance with the speed of easy cruelty. Cole answered none of it. He worked from first light until the stars sharpened, breaking only to water slate and eat cold bread with onions from his pantry sack. By the second week of October 1885, he had framed an inner door from doubled pine boards, filled the cavity with chaff and wool scraps for insulation, and hung it on strap hinges longer than his forearm to keep it true when frost swelled the jamb. He lined the entry corridor with pegged rails set waist-high, each rail wrapped in rawhide strips so gloved hands could find grip in blowing snow. At the corridor bend, he mounted an iron ring bolt through stone and timber both, testing it with his full weight until the post shuddered but held. He trusted no single material by itself. Wood split. Stone shifted. Iron rusted. Joined correctly, they endured. On the first Sunday after harvest prayer, Cole rode into town for lamp oil, kerosene tins, and 2 crates of canning jars from Pike's store. Gideon Pike met him at the counter in a coat trimmed with beaver and gloves, soft enough that no callus showed through the leather. He named prices 20% above those posted 2 days earlier, then explained with a smile shaped for spectators that rumor and fear had unsettled trade and forced prudent adjustments. Cole counted out the coins without argument. Behind him, 2 ranch hands laughed that a man building his own tomb ought to save on lamp oil and learn to see in the dark. A schoolboy repeated the grave pipe near the flour bins, and his mother lowered her eyes but did not correct him. When Cole loaded the mule, the church sexton, Abram Pike, younger brother to Gideon, and thinner in every way except certainty, stepped down from the boardwalk and said in a voice meant to carry, "You cannot stack enough beans to outwit heaven." Cole settled the crate straps and answered with the only line he gave the town that season. "Let them talk. Words do not bank a wall." Then he mounted and rode west without looking back. By the time he reached the rise, the northwestern sky had drawn a low iron color that old railmen recognized, and farmers dismissed until too late. 3 days later, he began the storage campaign in earnest. He bought 20 bushels of dry beans at $1.10 per bushel before rates climbed, 12 sacks of oats, 8 barrels of salt pork, 60 pounds of coffee, and 200 pounds of coarse salt in burlap that he repacked into lined bins. He traded survey work to the Cooper family for turnips, onions, and late potatoes, all of which he sorted by size and skin quality before lowering them into the stone-lined pantry pit on slatted shelves with 2-inch airflow gaps. He rendered tallow with the butcher in exchange for offcuts, poured 24 candles in tin molds, and hung each to cure where mice could not reach. In a ledger column headed Heat and Light, he listed every pound and inch: resinous pine, coal dust, lampwick, tinder packets sealed in waxed cloth. Arithmetic governed what sentiment could not. The post house interior took shape by measurement rather than imagination. Along the south wall, he built 2 bunk tiers, each berth 24 inches wide and 72 inches long, with plank fronts notched to hold rolled blankets above floor damp. He left space for 16 souls, then reconsidered and framed for 24. By reducing aisle width from 30 inches to 26 and shifting the stove platform 8 inches east. At the rear, he installed a brick bake recess with a baffled iron plate so one fire could warm both chamber and oven, and he set a water barrel stand 3 inches above floorstone to prevent freeze lock at the base. On a peg by the inner door, he hung 6 coiled rope lines cut in measured lengths, 12 feet, 24, 36, 40, 60, and 80. He tested each knot blindfolded at dusk, fingers learning what eyes would lose in white wind. Late in October, teamsters from the West Road began to use the chimney as a bearing mark even before true storms began. They saw smoke and adjusted course, then stopped for water, warm broth, or a bunk if wheels had broken on shale. Cole kept a narrow ledger near the stove and asked only initials, date, and direction traveled. Most entries were brief, written in uncertain hands. J. Finch, eastbound ore team, 1 horse lame. T. Hale, mail run delayed by axle pin. B. Norden and Son, cattle papers for county seat. Some left coins, some nails. One left a brass compass with a cracked glass face. Cole accepted all without ceremony and spent each offering on more stores, more rope, more hinges, more certainty. By mid-November 1885, the town had noticed that strangers now asked for the rise before they asked for Pike's store. That transfer of first question from commerce to shelter unsettled Gideon Pike more than any insult returned could have done. He answered by expanding ridicule into policy. He told wholesalers that Ramsey spread winter panic and should receive no credit extension through endurance accounts. He told the blacksmith that nails sold to the rise supported foolishness that frightened families. He told customers gathered near the stove that no respectable settlement had ever depended on one widower's chimney signal to conduct trade. The shelves behind him remained full then, lit amber by lamplight, and abundance often wins arguments in fair weather. The first hard warning came from the sky itself on December the 2nd, 1885, when an unnaturally warm wind blew from the southwest at dawn and by dusk turned north with a drop of 30 degrees in less than 4 hours. Cole watched cloud layers sheer in opposite directions and sent 2 notes into town by a livery errand boy, a stable hand not yet 15, who sometimes took odd jobs for supper money. One note went to the church, one to Pike's store, each requesting that families pre-position blankets, flour, and lamp fuel in storm-safe cellars before Christmas. Gideon read his note on the store porch, folded it carefully, and told those listening that endurance would not be governed by fear delivered through a boy. The note went into his coat pocket and did nothing. Snow came light that week and melted. Then came quiet days, clear and cold, with nights bright enough for long shadows at midnight. False calm settled over endurance like a closed hand, not yet clenched. Cole used the reprieve to sink a second ash pit and extend the chimney cleanout so crosswind backdraft could be cleared without opening the main chamber door. He paid the same errand boy 10 cents per day to carry water and sort kindling by size, and the boy learned quickly not only the task but the reason beneath each task. Feed the fire too fast, and flue heat cracks mortar. Feed too slow and draft collapses. Store flour against stone and moisture takes it. Leave an air gap and it keeps. Practical doctrine moved from one generation to the next without speech-making, as it had moved from Elias Ramsey to his son. Through January and February 1886, endurance saw only ordinary cold, enough to mock preparation, but not enough to test it. Laughter returned to the boardwalks. The nickname, the grave pipe, turned into a children's rhyme chanted near the hitch rail. Cole continued building as if none of it had reached him. He deepened the well curb with dry-laid rock, fitted a windbreak fence of cottonwood posts around the stock pen, and drove iron hooks at shoulder height along the path from door to water, 12 paces apart, to guide hands when visibility failed. He purchased 2 extra cast-iron stove grates at $1.80 each and stored them in greasecloth. Tools break when stores are closed. He had seen this too often to leave it to luck. By the second week of April 1886, with thaw mud pulling wagon wheels to the hubs and meadowlarks calling in draws that still held old ice, Cole expanded the bunk wall again. A hired hand from the Cooper place held boards while Cole marked cuts, and the man asked why a widower would build for numbers he did not own. Cole drove a peg, set his square, and answered without looking up, because wind does not ask who mocked you before it enters a house. Then he set the next brace, checked level, and moved on. In May, geese moved north in uneven, broken lines, and beaver on Cotton Run raised repairs higher again despite full banks. Cole noted both in the ledger margin beside fuel counts and grain tallies. He rode to Endurance on market day and bought the last lot of heavy canvas before summer caravans arrived, paying $3.40 for enough to cut storm hoods and door skirts. Gideon Pike watched the transaction, then told a cluster of farmers that Ramsey's folly would soon become Ramsey's burden when rot and vermin claimed the buried walls. Yet that same afternoon, 2 emigrant wagons from the Colorado Road turned toward the chimney smoke and not toward town first, and they left at dawn with full water casks and directions pinned in careful script. By June 1886, the rise no longer looked like a grave to those who relied on distance and weather for wages. It looked like a post. Not a grand one, not a profitable one, but a fixed point in a country where fixed points determined who arrived and who vanished between horizons. Cole kept working under the long light, adding shelves, sealing cracks, recalculating rations at 1 1/4 pounds of dry food per soul per day for sustained cold confinement. In Endurance, Gideon Pike kept speaking of progress and confidence, while his brother Abram repeated that caution insulted Providence. Between those two convictions, the town chose comfort. On the rise, one widower chose mathematics. On the rise, one widower chose mathematics, and he widened that arithmetic through the long light of June until the post house no longer resembled a private shelter but an instrument calibrated for many hands and many hungers. He reset the interior plan with charcoal marks on the floorstone, reduced aisle turns that wasted movement, and built a third bunk tier on the north wall with braces seated directly into limestone pockets so the frame would not rack when 40 pairs of boots struck the planks in urgency. Each berth measured 24 inches by 72. Each front board rose 14 inches to keep sleepers from rolling during crowded nights, and each support post received a diagonal knee brace pinned with oak pegs driven wet and left to swell dry. He added not elegance but capacity. He measured load by load, then tested every span by hanging sacks of sand where sleeping bodies would lie, because timber that held quiet weight could still fail under sudden crowd pressure. When 2 pegs split, he replaced the entire brace assembly before supper. By the last week of June 1886, he had completed a second vented storage pit 8 feet behind the bake recess, lined in stone, floored in slatted cottonwood, and capped with a double hatch sealed in wool felt and beeswax. Into that chamber he moved flour sacks repacked in stitched canvas liners, then stacked them on cedar runners 3 inches above stone, so ground damp could not wick upward. He marked each sack with lamp-black date codes and rotated them by week, oldest to front, newest to rear. He hung cured pork from crossbars at shoulder height, rubbed each length with coarse salt and pepper ash, and left an exact hand width between cuts for airflow. For water security, he set 2 reserve barrels in cradle racks strapped to wall rings, each rack braced to absorb floor vibration from storm traffic. Nothing in the post house stood without being anchored twice. He gave equal care to the chimney, which had become both heat engine and signal mast. At dawn, he burned dry cottonwood to prime the flue, then shifted to resinous pine and coal dust for denser, darker output visible at distance. He kept a draft log in quarter-hour entries, wind direction, gust estimates, plume height, draw steadiness, ash color, and fuel consumed to maintain a continuous column above the stack lip. On days when crosswind tore the smoke to ribbons, he adjusted the damper plate by finger-width increments and watched for a reattachment in the lee. He shaped a cowl ring from sheet iron and bolted it to stone with 4 anchor straps sunk into the top courses, not to block weather but to discipline it, giving the flue a stable throat under turbulent pressure. The work looked obsessive to anyone passing. It looked life-saving to any teamster who had ever lost a road in white wind. 3 days passed before his supply ledger showed the first summer pattern that mattered. Traffic from the west was increasing while purchases in endurance remained complacent. 2 ore teams from the foothill route, 1 family wagon from Julesburg country, and a mail rider out of Elkhorn all marked the post ledger in the same week, and each entry included some variation of the same phrase: smoke seen at distance, course corrected, arrival secured. Cole took no fee schedule. He accepted what was offered: a horseshoe keg of nails, a sack of barley, a bolt of coarse wool, a hand pump washer set, and once a small medicine chest with cracked hinges and intact tincture bottles. He cleaned each bottle, relabeled each stopper, and placed the chest near the inner door where frostbitten fingers could reach it without crossing the chamber. In town, Gideon Pike understood the transfer of trust before anyone said it plainly. His store still held bright stock and polished counters, yet travelers now asked for the rise in the same breath as they asked for grain prices, and settled families had begun buying extra salt and flour in quantities that hinted at imitation. Pike answered by hardening ridicule into pressure. He raised the cost of lamp oil from 30 to 39 cents per gallon before any first snow, called it prudent anticipation, and told buyers that panic purchasing invited scarcity. He quoted nail prices by weight and then withheld smaller lots, forcing poor households to pay for bulk they did not need. He refused to extend routine credit to any hand who hauled stone, timber, or fodder to Cole's acreage, and he kept a slate behind the counter where those names were marked for all clerks to see. In endurance, reputation moved faster than wagons. A marked name paid more for nearly everything. The social cruelty followed policy with frontier efficiency. Boys chalked the grave pipe on fence rails near the church lane. Men at the blacksmith fire asked, loud enough for apprentices to hear, whether Cole planned to bury Endurance one bunk at a time. On market Saturdays, when women lined for flour and sewing needles, Gideon recited the same polished line that had first entertained the porch crowd and now governed the town's self-regard. Ambition builds communities. Fear hollows them. He spoke it as doctrine, and many repeated it because prosperity had a human face in his doorway, while caution looked like one widower and a mud-banked roof. Abram Pike reinforced it after Sunday service with language of providence and fortitude, saying preparation beyond reason could become a form of distrust. No official vote was taken. None was needed. Endurance chose the comfort of agreement. Cole responded as he had always responded, by building and by service that asked no witness. When the Cooper widow's stove flue cracked in a wind shift, he walked in before dawn with mortar, brick scrap, and a short ladder, repaired the seam and left before her sons returned from pasture. When a wheelwright's child burned a hand on a kettle hinge, he sent salve from the medicine chest and wrote clear use instructions in block letters the father could read by low lamp. When two ranch hands lost bearings in a dust squall east of Cotton Run, Slate brought them to the post line, and Cole sent them onward with canteens refilled and directions tied in oilcloth to the lead rein. He neither advertised these acts nor refused those who had mocked him. The town called that stubbornness. The travelers called it reliability. By the second week of August, a dry heat settled over western Nebraska that cured grass too early and left creek edges ringed in cracked silt, then vanished in one abrupt cold rain that dropped nighttime temperature 21 degrees in 6 hours. Cole read the shift not as relief, but as signal. He rode Cotton Run at dawn and found beaver repairs lifted again, thicker and higher than spring flood marks warranted. He cut one cross-section from a fresh lodge wall and measured packed mud depth against last year's notes. The increase was near 2 inches. He checked muskrat houses in the backwater slough and noted dome walls built broad and high, winter architecture laid down before autumn had properly begun. In rail country, those signs had preceded lockup storms and prolonged drifts. Here they were dismissed as animal habit. He carried the evidence into Endurance in a burlap sack, cattail strips from muskrat packing, willow lengths from elevated beaver runs, and a pressure log copied from his field book. At the church steps after service, with 143 souls still standing in coat sleeves under clear sky, he asked again for communal reserves and a relay plan. He proposed 2 practical measures only: each household to hold 14 days of grain and fuel above daily use, and the church cellar to store a shared emergency lot of beans, oats, and lamp oil under appointed keys. Gideon Pike listened with folded arms and gave his answer in the same public tone he used for prices and proclamations. Endurance will not kneel before weather stories and rodent engineering. Ramsey sees doom in every cloud, because doom is what he built. Laughter came quickly, thinner than before, but still present. Abram Pike added that fear spread faster than sickness and was just as costly. One line of time settled the matter more than any argument. By early September 1886, only 6 households had quietly begun laying additional stores, and all 6 did so without saying why. Cole adjusted his planning window from theory to countdown. He purchased 40 extra yards of heavy rope at 11 cents per yard, boiled it in salt water and tallow to resist icing, then stretched, dried, and coiled each line on separate pegs. He reinforced the already rigged door-to-well guide run, replacing weathered posts and reseating shoulder-high eye bolts on the 12-pace spacing. Then extended matching lines from the well curb to the stock pen and onward to the ash pit, so movement routes linked under one system. He cut storm hoods from summer canvas, stitched seam allowances double, and rubbed the thread lines with wax against wind-driven wet. He fabricated sled drags from ash planks and iron runners scavenged from a broken hay sleigh, each drag size to carry one adult and 2 children or equivalent load in fuel sacks. He tested turn radius on packed dirt and then on first skim frost, revising runner angle by 1/4 inch to reduce side bite. Elias Boone, the stable hand not yet 15, remained mostly a figure at the margins of this phase, appearing in short intervals when the Boone yard sent him up with a message, a receipt, or a borrowed tool to be returned before dusk. He took occasional coin for small tasks, 5 cents for half a day splitting kindling, 6 for a water haul when teams were short. But he did not stay long, and Cole did not fold him into the work plan. Still, the boy watched with a seriousness uncommon in those taught to laugh on command. When other boys sang the grave pipe near the hitch rail, Elias kept his eyes on the posts, the smoke, and the way Cole checked each knot twice before moving on. In late September, Endurance received one more warning that arrived clothed as comfort. 4 warm days rolled in from the south, shirt-sleeve weather in a month that should have smelled of frost, and townsfolk called it a blessing that proved Pike correct. Wagons moved late into evening, so doors stood open after supper. Gideon hosted a confident supper near the store porch and spoke of expansion, spring contracts, and the futility of burying one's life in earthworks. Cole did not attend. He spent those evenings sealing door skirts, checking flue joints, and shifting fuel stacks under tighter cover. The warmth had a sharp edge that older trail hands recognized and younger men mistook for mercy. On the 5th morning, frost silvered every rail and the north wind returned hard enough to strip breath from speech. During the first week of October, he rode claim to claim among those 6 cautious households and left written instructions weighted beneath stones at each threshold. Bank your north walls 2 feet with sod. Line window seams with cloth and tallow. Keep shovel and rope inside, not out. Pre-cut kindling by size and store dry against interior wall. Never travel alone once sustained wind exceeds 30. He asked no payment. He accepted no promises. At dusk, he stood beside the chimney and sent a deliberate black plume into the tightening sky. 3 long burns and 1 short. The private code he had agreed upon with 2 teamsters and the Boone stable. Signal active, shelter open, lines set. By the 3rd week of October 1886, geese crossed south in dense low files under a copper sky, and they did not circle the marshes as they usually did before moving on. They flew with purpose and did not look down. Cole watched from the rise while Slate shifted uneasily in the pen and pressed flank against the lee fence. In Endurance, doors closed earlier, but not from conviction, from weather. Gideon Pike kept his lamps bright and his shelves arranged full-facing to the street. Abundance displayed against uncertainty like an argument that could still be won. On the rise, Cole counted sacks, checked hooks, trimmed wicks, and retensioned the standing lifeline from door ring to well post before testing the newer branches to pen and ash pit with gloved hands that moved without haste and without doubt. The final days of October passed under a sky that remained clear too long, and then, on December the 3rd, 1886, certainty finally arrived from the east in the form of a telegraph rider who came into Endurance with ice crusted on his collar and one message repeated at every stop. Rail traffic west of North Platte had stalled in drifted cuts and mechanical failures, and freight priority had shifted to military and bridge repair. The practical meaning was immediate. If a prolonged storm closed the wagon road, Endurance would stand alone with whatever sat in its bins that morning. Cole heard the news before noon from Elias Boone, who rode hard to the rise with the paper folded in oilcloth, then stayed while Cole recalculated rations from traveler shelter to town contingency. By lantern light that night, Bunks designed for 24 were remeasured for 40, aisle width cut again, and dry food allotment fixed at 1¼ pounds per soul per day. He did not announce alarm. He altered math. By the second week of December, daytime highs hovered near 26 degrees, and nights settled below zero, often enough to keep stock troughs rimmed thick by dawn. Endurance answered with divided habits. 6 cautious households banked walls, cut extra kindling, and carried flour to cellar shelves. The rest trusted market routine. Gideon Pike held his confidence meetings beneath warm lamps and full rafters, saying the town had survived winters before and would survive this one by discipline and trade, not by copying a widower's burrow. His store remained the brightest building on Main Street, dry goods stacked to the ceiling, pork barrels sealed, kerosene tins in neat rows that implied continuity even as incoming freight faltered. Cole said little. He stretched new guide ropes, marked knots at 10-foot intervals with cloth wraps that could be counted by numb hands, and staged sled drags beside the inner door. Christmas week gave Endurance a deceptive calm. 3 afternoons rose above freezing. Mud appeared in wagon ruts, and the unprepared took the thaw as vindication. Teams ran longer routes. Families burned through split wood meant for January because replacements still seemed available. On December 28th, the barometer at Cole's wall dropped in a single long slide, rebounded sharply by evening, then fell again before midnight. He had seen that pattern along northern grades where air masses collided over open cuts and built blizzards that lasted not hours, but days. On December the 30th, he rode into town and told any soul who paused to listen that open travel after first hard gusts would become lethal. Gideon answered from his porch that fear had become Cole's profession. The phrase drew a thin laugh now, not the full-bodied approval of summer. Yet it remained enough to keep many in place. The storm's first edge struck on January the 7th, 1887, with a low wind and dry snow that looked harmless until one measured accumulation against time. 4 inches became 9 by dusk, and drifts at fence corners rose knee-high overnight. On January 8th, temperature held at 18 degrees through noon. Then wind veered north-northwest and began to climb, first 20 miles an hour, then 35 before supper, carrying new snow in horizontal sheets that erased wagon tracks within minutes. Cole lit the chimney in deliberate intervals, dense black plumes by day and high flame at night, and sent Elias with 2 final warnings to households nearest town center. Move now with blankets and flour. While movement remained possible, Elias returned near dark with 2 families and 1 old man who could not walk unaided, then stood in the entry shaking with cold and said 3 words that had not yet entered public speech in Endurance. They waited too long. On January 9th, catastrophe arrived with the speed of a dropped gate. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the thermometer outside Cole's door read 14 degrees. By 4 it read -9. By dusk it read -31, with gusts measured at the post line by weighted flag and timing cord, passing 50 miles an hour. The wind was no longer weather. It was force applied without pause. Snow did not fall so much as strike. Visibility shortened from 50 yards to 10, then to the length of an outstretched arm. Houses built for ordinary prairie cold began to fail by sequence. First window seams, then door thresholds, then roof edges where old nails lifted under drift load. Stoves drafted backward in 2-frame homes on Cotton Lane, filling rooms with smoke as families fought both cold and breath. Wagons tied at the hitch rail vanished to axle depth, then tongue depth, then under sculpted drifts that made each street look abandoned by design rather than by panic. Endurance's improvised plans failed quickly. The church cellar filled beyond safe capacity and lost heat when the outer doors could not be sealed against packed snow. A ranch bunkhouse south of town burned half its stored wood in one night, because chinks had not been banked and wind pulled warmth through walls as if siphoning a barrel dry. Two men attempted to run a rope from the blacksmith to Pike's store after midnight, but they had tied to porch railings rather than anchored posts. One railing tore loose and both men crawled back blind with frostbitten hands, having advanced less than 40 yards. By the morning of January 10th, the main road could no longer be found as road. Fence lines disappeared. Orientation collapsed. Teams that had tried to move during the night circled and returned to their own tracks, then stopped from exhaustion where they stood. At the rise, Cole's preparations held under strain. The earth-bermed walls stayed near 52 degrees in the chamber core, while outside air remained far below zero. The angled entry and double doors reduced heat loss enough that intake could continue without freezing the whole room each time the latch lifted. The chimney draft faltered twice under crosswind bursts and recovered after ash pit clearing exactly as designed. He worked without pause and without spectacle, assigning places, drying gloves near but never on the stove, measuring food by scoop weight rather than plea, and recording names in the ledger with the same hand he had used for stone counts. He sent Slade along fixed lifelines where riding remained possible, then dismounted and led when drifts deepened above the horse's chest. The guide ropes between door, well, and pen became a moving spine for all outside work. Those who gripped them reached the door. Those who trusted memory alone often did not. By the evening of January 10th, human cost had sharpened from risk into fact. Thomas Hale, the mail driver whose initials had appeared in Cole's traveler ledger for nearly 2 years, was found a quarter-mile east of town kneeling against his lead team with the dispatch satchel tied beneath his coat to keep it dry. He had turned his body to shield the pouch and likely believed until the final minutes that he would still deliver on schedule. The horses stood over him when Cole and 2 ranch hands reached the site by line and lantern. They brought the satchel back. Thomas did not survive. His wife, Lena Hale, took the bag in both hands and sat beside the stove without speaking, while names were read from the frozen papers he had preserved with his life. Ruth Ellery died before dawn on January 11th, within sight of the rise chimney she had taught children to identify on slates. She had left the schoolhouse annex when roof joists began to bow and wrap 2 younger boarders in her wool cloak, one at each side, guiding them by fence post intervals toward what she judged was the post line. She made the right direction and the right decisions, but not enough distance. Cole found them by touch and voice in white darkness, both children alive beneath her arms, Ruth seated upright against drifted rails as if pausing for breath between lessons. The children were carried in on a sled drag and lived. Ruth Ellery was carried in after them and laid near the interior wall until ground could be opened. No soul in the chamber mistook what her final hour had purchased. The third death struck endurance at its center and broke the illusion that status could bargain with weather. Abram Pike had remained at the general store with 4 boarders through the second night, convinced the thick goods and central stove made the building safer than movement across open street. Near midnight, drift load accumulated unevenly on the leeward roof where old beams had not been reinforced since the spring leak. Witnesses later said they heard 3 sharp reports like gunstocks striking plank, then a heavy sag. Abram pushed 2 boarders toward the rear door and held the inner passage while they crawled through packed snow. A final beam gave way before he reached the threshold. He did not survive the collapse. The 2 he had shoved clear lived, one with a broken wrist, one with a deep shoulder bruise, both repeating that Abram had turned back for another blanket when the roof dropped. By dawn, Gideon Pike's great store stood dark, front windows blown in, upper shelving toppled, ledgers soaked and fused into pulp beneath snowmelt and ash. The building that had represented permanence now looked temporary as kindling. 3 days passed under continuous storm pulses. Brief lulls followed by harder squalls, and every hour tightened the same equation: calories, fuel, bodies, time. In that interval, desperation moved through endurance in visible stages. First came denial, then bargaining, then the practical surrender that sends one neighbor to knock at another door. The cautious 6 households reached Cole's line system early and survived with fewer injuries. Others delayed until woodpiles shrank and interior frost formed on bedroom walls. Children coughed in unvented rooms. Elderly souls could not warm extremities no matter how close they sat to iron stoves because drafts crossed floorboards unchecked. Pike's remaining clerks tried to ration stock from a side shed, but found most tins frozen to split seams and flour turned to paste where meltwater had entered. By the night of January 11th, endurance had ceased discussing pride. It discussed roots. The approach to the rise began in fragments and then became a procession. Elias Boone led the first organized group from town center, tied at intervals to a main rope with knots pre-counted from Cole's instructions, each adult responsible for one child or one elder. No one untethered, no one carrying more than blanket roll and food sack. They reached the outer hook line at the stock pen shortly after midnight and signaled with 2 lantern dips as agreed. Cole and 2 volunteers hauled them through the final drift corridor, stripped ice from scarves and seated them by wall order to preserve airflow around the stove. 40 became 48. 48 became 53. Space narrowed to inches and still the door opened again. Just before dawn on 12th of January, Gideon Pike came up the line on foot with beard rimed white and one gloved hand fixed around the shoulder of a boy from the Cooper yard. He no longer resembled the man who had pronounced policy from a warm porch. His coat was torn at the hem, one boot lacked its outer buckle, and his voice broke on the first attempt to speak over the wind. He steadied himself against the door ring, removed his glove, and addressed Cole not as rival, but as witness. There are 13 behind me at the church lane, and 2 cannot walk without support. I barred this door to poor men 3 nights ago. I was wrong then, open now for any soul we can still reach. Cole held his gaze for one measured moment, then stepped aside, placed a coil of rope in Gideon's hands and said, "Tie in at 3-knot spacing. We bring them by order. Smallest first. Move." Gideon Pike nodded once, tied the first loop around his own waist, and stepped back into the white dark with Elias Boone at his shoulder and 2 ranch hands on the tail line, each man counting knots by touch, as Cole had taught until the storm swallowed their lantern glow. Inside, Cole shifted immediately from threshold to order. He placed Lena Hale and the 2 rescued schoolchildren near the warm inner wall, moved dry kindling from reserve stack to stove side, and set ration scoops on the table so no hand guessed at portions in panic. Fear still moved through the chamber, but procedure moved faster. The rope team returned with 11 souls on the first run, then went out again before boots had fully thawed, because 13 had been reported, and arithmetic did not wait for comfort. On the second pass, they brought the final 2. One elderly woman half-carried between Gideon and Elias, one carpenter with a frozen ear, and one hand gone rigid around an empty lamp tin. The chamber rose to 64 souls by dawn, then 68 by noon, after a family from Cotton Lane reached the outer hooks and signaled with 3 bell strikes against iron. Cole recorded each arrival in the ledger, not from habit alone but from responsibility, because names counted for rations, for work assignments, and later for graves, letters, and memory. By January 13th, the rescue had become a system rather than a series of desperate acts. Cole divided the able adults into watches of 6 hours, set 1 team for fuel processing, 1 for snowmelt and water barrel management, 1 for sanitation trench maintenance at the lee side ash corridor, and 1 for line patrol when gusts dropped below the threshold where travel became pure hazard. Gideon asked where he should stand. Cole handed him a splitting maul and pointed to the covered wood rack. "You cut to measured lengths. 12 inches for stove feed, 18 for reserve. Stack bark out. Keep it dry." Gideon bowed his head once and obeyed without speech. The contrast between costly confidence and modest preparation stood plain to every soul in endurance during those days. Pike's store had carried fine goods, imported cloth, polished counters, and high winter rates. Yet one unreinforced roof and one blocked flue had reduced that investment to soaked paper and broken shelves. Cole's post had been built from salvage beams, rough limestone, tallow-sealed seams, and hand-cut rope lines, and it held warmth, order, and life under worse pressure each hour. The lesson was not abstract. It could be touched in the wall temperature, tasted in measured broth, and seen in the simple fact that children slept through the wind while adults took their turns at labor. When panic rose, Cole answered it with instruction. He showed 3 men how to bank interior drafts with rolled wool at floor seams and not at shoulder height where heat already collected. He taught 2 women to rotate damp mittens on a cord line 4 feet from the stove mouth, so fibers dried without scorching. He had Elias mark ration buckets with charcoal lines by weight, 1 1/4 pounds dry goods per soul per day, then reduce by 1 ounce for adults on low labor watches, and increase by 1 ounce for line crews and nursing mothers. He demonstrated stove baffling with a brick plate and explained why a fierce short burn wasted fuel, while a steady medium burn preserved both heat and chimney draw. No sermon, only method. 3 days later, when winds eased for the first time below 20 miles an hour, Cole led a burial detail by rope to ground that could be opened with picks and hot ash. Gideon went with that detail as assigned, along with 2 men who had once laughed at the grave pipe by the hitch rail. Thomas Hale was laid first with his dispatch satchel placed beside him at Lena's request, after the post papers had been dried and copied. Ruth Ellery was laid second, and the 2 children she had shielded stood between adults holding each other's sleeves while the prayer was read. Abram Pike was laid third, and Gideon set the marker post himself with both hands, striking until it seated true. No one spoke mockery then. The wind carried only the sound of tools and brief names. On January the 19th, 1887, 10 days after the great drop, the storm train finally broke in full. The road did not reopen at once, yet sky returned in blue fractures between trailing cloud bands, and the thermometer climbed to 6 degrees above zero by mid-afternoon. Teams could move short distances again if tied to guidelines. Cole kept the post open continuously for another week, refusing all attempts to settle accounts until every household had fuel, sealed windows, and at least 7 days of dry ration under roof. He sent Gideon and 4 others with sled drags to recover what could be salvaged from the ruined store-side shed. Intact salt barrels, 2 crates of split peas, 3 tins of lampwick, and 1 locked medicine box found beneath a fallen joist. Each item was entered in Cole's ledger, then redistributed by household size. By the first week of February, endurance had shifted from survival to rebuilding, and the reckoning began not with speeches but with footsteps to Cole's door. The Cooper widow came first with 2 sacks of flour, and said she had laughed when others laughed and had no excuse worth naming. A blacksmith who had charged him extra for spikes in autumn brought a bundle of sharpened tools and set them down without bargaining. 2 ranch hands who had repeated Gideon's porch lines offered 3 days of labor to deepen the post well curb before spring melt. Some apologies were direct, some stumbled, some arrived as work performed in silence. Cole accepted labor where labor was needed and kept his answer consistent. Put your hands to the task. That is the useful part. 1 line of time marked the public turn. By early March 1887, every household in Endurance had begun a cellar or wall banking project, and no child sang the grave pipe in the street again. The church gathering took place on March 13th, with 241 souls present. The missing counted in graves, outmigration, and illness still recovering. The benches were filled with patched coats and faces changed by 10 winter days that had altered hierarchy more completely than any election. Gideon Pike stood at the front not in merchant wool but in a plain work coat stained at cuff and hem from woodcutting and grave detail. He held no notes. When he began, his voice carried less force than it once had from his porch, yet it carried farther because no one was waiting to laugh. "I named this place Ramsey's Folly, and then the grave pipe," he said. "I sold confidence by the gallon and called caution bad for trade. I raised prices before scarcity, barred my back room to men who could not pay, and mistook full shelves for wisdom. My brother Abram died under a roof I had not reinforced, in a building I claimed was safer than movement. I asked entry at Cole Ramsey's door with frost on my beard, and pride gone from me, and he gave rope, orders, and shelter without asking what I had said of him. Pride cost this town lives. My own pride cost my brother his." He paused, then looked to Lena Hale, to the 2 Ellery children seated with the Cooper family, and continued, "I cannot purchase back Thomas Hale, who kept mail dry while his own strength failed. I cannot repay Ruth Ellery, who wrapped children and gave her own warmth for theirs. I cannot speak Abram upright from the ground. I can state plainly what is left for a man to do when his words have done harm. I was wrong. Publicly, repeatedly, and with influence I did not deserve." Then Gideon reached into his coat and placed a folded deed on the communion table. "I transfer 2 adjacent acres bordering the Ramsey Rise to common trust for endurance, designated as relay ground, storage extension, and open shelter under winter signal. This transfer is immediate and without lien. If accepted, it will be recorded at county seat on the next passable road." The room remained quiet long enough for stove iron to tick. Then others rose in turn, not every soul, but enough to complete the reckoning as communal fact rather than one man's confession. The blacksmith stated that he had profited from ridicule and from inflated tool prices, and said he would forge hooks and bolts for every low-income household at cost through next winter. Abram's surviving boarders testified that the merchant's brother had pushed them to safety and asked that his memory not be flattened to his mistakes. Lena Hale stood with Thomas's satchel in her hands and said she would keep delivering his route papers to the church records because duty had defined him and should define the town. No one asked Cole to erase grief with a single sentence. When at last all faces turned toward him, Cole remained seated for a moment, gloved hands resting on his knees, as if measuring load before lifting. Then he stood and spoke in the same measured register with which he had assigned watches in the storm. "I will not pretend your words did not wound," he said. "They did. I heard every name and carried everyone to work the next day. I will also not pretend that this winter was a private contest that I won. Thomas Hale is dead. Ruth Ellery is dead. Abram Pike is dead. 3 graves stand where no argument can reach. If you ask whether I forgive in one quick breath, I cannot give you that. Grief is not a ledger line to strike through by vote." He placed one hand on the deed, then withdrew it. "What I can give is instruction. My father taught me that winter is arithmetic. I have taught some of you the same. I will teach any household willing to learn without fee. Beginning this Thursday at first light on the Rise, we will cover wall banking, flue maintenance, fuel math, rope placement, and shared reserve accounting. You will build your own security. You will teach your children. Whether that becomes forgiveness is a longer matter, and it belongs to conduct over years, not to one meeting." The deed was accepted. 2 witnesses signed. On March 21st, when roads finally carried wagons to county seat, the transfer was recorded under Endurance Common Relay Ground, popularly called the Ramsey Post before spring had fully turned. Years passed, and the legacy took shape not in statues but in standard practice. By October 1890, Endurance counted 312 souls and maintained 3 communal grain bins, each audited at harvest and sealed with 2 keys held by separate households. Every new house permit included earth-berming plans on north and west walls. Church minutes recorded mandatory winter drill dates for line movement between key buildings. The blacksmith shop kept a shelf marked Ramsey Hardware, iron hooks, ring bolts, and rope thimbles, sold at controlled prices from September through February. On outlying claims, families raised shorter signal chimneys with double-throat draws modeled from Cole's original measurements, and teamsters crossing 40 miles of open country began to say, not in mockery now, but in practical respect, "Build it Ramsey high." Cole never became a public orator. He remained what he had always been, a surveyor of risk and distance. He taught in work clothes with chalk, rope, and shovel. Elias Boone, grown to manhood, became his principal assistant by 1892 and kept duplicate ledgers with cleaner script than Cole had ever managed. Gideon Pike rebuilt a smaller store with reinforced beams, reduced margins on winter essentials, and an open back room designated shelter in every storm notice. He still carried grief for Abram, and he carried it as labor, not as performance. Decades later, the tall chimney still stands above the grass sea west of Endurance, weathered, lime-paled, and visible in clear air from miles away. Travelers still use it as a bearing when cloud lowers and wind begins to hunt the flats. Children still learn the names Thomas Hale, Ruth Ellery, and Abram Pike from church records and from the marker line on the rise, and they learn that preparation is not fear, but care measured ahead of need. On the stone lintel inside the old post door, cut by Elias Boone in 1904, and traced each spring with lampblack so the letters remain legible, the inscription reads in plain words that outlived mockery: "Pride is a poor coat. Knowledge shared is warmer." On the morning Elias Boone first darkened the carved letters with lampblack, he stood on a short ladder beneath the lintel while Cole held the tin cup and a rag, and neither man spoke until the final stroke was filled, and the words came forward against the pale stone, as if they had always waited there. The wind had dropped after dawn. The temperature sat at 38 degrees, and the grass sea around the rise moved in long, quiet bands under a high April sky. Gideon Pike arrived on foot from town with a wrapped parcel under his arm and removed his hat at the threshold before he stepped inside. He set the parcel on the table where ration scoops once lay, an unfolded cloth from a brass compass with cracked glass, the old traveler offering left years earlier by a westbound teamster. Cole recognized it at once. Gideon turned it once in his hand and spoke without performance. "I found this in my salvage crate from the old store, sealed in wax paper with your mark. I had kept it, telling myself I would return it when I had chosen proper words. I have chosen none that improve the delay. It belongs to this post, where men corrected their course." Cole took the compass, tested the needle swing, and set it beside Thomas Hale's copied route pages, now bound in oilskin and kept on the inner shelf. "Then it remains here," he said, "not as ornament, as instruction." He looked toward Elias on the ladder. "Set a hook near the ledger case." By late afternoon, 21 souls had come up from Endurance for spring maintenance day, carrying lime sacks, rope coils, split pine, and 2 kegs of iron bolts forged through winter contract rates the blacksmith had kept since his church pledge. The old cracked medicine chest stood open near the stove with bottles cleaned, relabeled and arranged in rows by use: willow bark tincture, camphor liniment, carbolic solution, sterile bandage rolls cut from boiled linen. Beside it, the locked medicine box recovered from Pike's shed years before had finally yielded to a careful drill and hinge lift. 3 intact morphia vials had been transferred under church custody, and the box itself now held only needles, sutures, and scalpels wrapped in oiled cloth. Nothing remained uncounted. Nothing remained mysterious. That evening, with light fading and the chimney drawing clean, Elias read aloud from the winter inventory board, while Cole checked entries against the old storm ledger. Beans 410 pounds, oats 286, split peas 143, salt pork 198, coffee 62, tallow candles 179, lamp oil 51 gallons, wick rolls 24 tins, coal dust 11 sacks, resinous pine 2.5 cords under cover, rope lengths from 12 to 80 feet all inspected and retallowed. Gideon listened from the doorway, then lifted his head toward the hooks along the corridor and asked, "Do you still trust the 3-knot spacing?" Cole answered as if reciting a law of soil and wind. "At night, in gusts above 40 with mixed experience in the line, yes. In daylight under 20, 2-knot spacing is faster and safe. You learned both. You teach both now." 3 days passed before the county clerk's wagon reached the rise with 2 sealed documents and a brass bell from the North Platte Rail Office. The clerk read the letter aloud by the stove. The delayed telegraph warning of December 1886 had been copied into division records, and the Ramsey Post was recognized as an unofficial but critical relay during the isolation period. No medal came with the paper, no payment, no city ceremony, only a line entered into freight history and a bell cast from locomotive scrap marked with the date December 3rd, 1886. Cole accepted it, weighed it in his hand, and instructed Elias to mount it by the inner door for storm watch changes. "External report," answered at last. By January 1894, a hard blow came again out of the north and drove temperatures to -24 by midnight, but Endurance met it as a town that had learned from grief rather than merely remembered it. Signal chimneys on 7 outlying claims lit in sequence from dusk. Guidelines ran between church, smithy, cooper shed, and 3 cellar clusters. Families arrived at shelters by assignment lists, posted each November. No child traveled outside line protection, and no elder was left in an unbanked room. Cole remained at the post, directing intake and fuel cadence, while Elias managed town relays with 2 line captains and 1 lantern code board. 40 miles of open country still carried danger, yet that week no soul from Endurance died. 2 freight men from Wyoming Territory reached the chimney at dawn on the 2nd day, with eyelashes crusted white and hands near useless. They lived because the old doctrine had become common practice. After that storm, reckoning moved into its final, quieter form. Not confession before benches, but the long discipline of correction witnessed in deeds. Gideon Pike closed his ledger on speculative winter markups and posted fixed prices each September for flour, oil, salt, and nails, signed in his own hand and copied at the church door. He funded reinforced roof beams for 12 poor households in one season, and then refused public thanks when the Reverend offered it. At Abram's marker on the 7th anniversary of the collapse, he met Cole alone at first light and spoke while frost still held in the grass. "I once believed authority was the right to be obeyed," Gideon said. "I now see that authority is the burden to prepare for those who do not stand in your doorway yet. I failed that burden and buried my brother under it." Cole stood with hat in both hands, looking not at Gideon but at the row of 3 names cut in stone on the rise. "You cannot repay the dead," he said. "You can lower the price the living pay next time. Keep doing that. Do not narrate yourself while doing it." Gideon gave one short nod. Then, that remains my work. By October 1899, with endurance at 327 souls, the church cellar held communal reserves under the two-key rule every winter, and school lessons included weather signs once mocked as superstition, beaver crest height, geese migration timing, abrupt pressure falls, false warm spells before Arctic drops. Ruth Ellery's two surviving boarders, now grown women, taught those lessons in alternating weeks and used her name each time before they began. Thomas Hale's copied route papers and a replica document case sat in a glass front display by the record shelf, marked that the original satchel had been buried with him. Every January, new route riders read the preserved copies before winter assignments. Abram Pike's story was taught with full weight, neither erased nor softened. He had spoken against caution, then died trying to push others out. Moral accounting remained specific. Cole Ramsey taught until his hands trembled too much to tie knots swiftly in the cold. On February 14, 1907, after a morning class on flue-baffling ratios and draft recovery under crosswind, he sat by the post stove while Elias finished the demonstrations, corrected one fuel figure from memory without opening the ledger, and then asked Gideon for water. He drank, set the tin cup down, and said, "Keep the numbers honest." He died before dusk with Elias and Gideon on either side of the bunk wall he had built for strangers. They buried him on the rise above the chamber roof in ground opened with ash and picks, just as he had once opened ground for others. The service held 301 souls in attendance and lasted until moonrise because each household sent one speaker with a single practical change learned from him. Wall berm depth increased, rope hooks reset, flour raised above stone, kindling sorted by size, stove burns slowed, pride reduced. No one called him saint. They called him teacher. The Ramsey post still stands. The chimney still throws a visible column when winter drills run in November. The brass rail bell still marks watch changes, and the cracked compass still hangs beside the traveler ledger where initials from 1885 remain legible under glass. Each spring, Elias Boone, then his daughter Miriam after him, traces the lintel words with lampblack so weather cannot erase what weather once proved. On clear days, travelers stop, read, and move on better prepared than they arrived. On storm days, they enter, are counted, fed by measure, assigned a bunk, and taught the line system before they sleep. Endurance keeps no monument grander than that routine, and it has needed none.